Okay, good morning, everyone. Apologize for the delay. We're kind of having some technical difficulties here this morning. I think that's actually going to be halfway decent, Jim.
Try.
So let's try to start our late episode of Ask the Agronomist, coming to you live, sorta, from our Roanoke focus site. Thanks so much to my colleague Jim Donnelly for joining us this morning. We have Amy Russell here, who is acting as our producer and keeping the iPad or the computer from falling off of the printer that we've got it propped up on. Thanks to Jennifer Elliott for troubleshooting this morning. We had some connection issues, so apologize for those that gave up on us and left. This was very reminiscent of our very first episode of Ask the Agronomist, where Troy Kazire and I crashed and burned trying to get on YouTube Live. So anyway, without any further ado, very, very happy to have Jim Donnelly here with us this morning. A month ago, I knew enough about tar spot to be dangerous. I've learned a lot more.
Still do.
I've learned a lot more in the last month, with thanks to this man here. So Jim and I really don't agree on presidential politics or whether Twitter or climate change is more humanity. But I do have a tremendous amount of respect for Jim's pathology knowledge, and he doesn't like being known as the tar spot guy within Bayer. But Jim does have a tremendous amount of experience with. Got him on with us here today. So, Jim, why don't you just kind of review, the history of tar spot in Illinois, when you first saw it, when it was first found, and kind of how it's progressed over the years.
Sure. So actually had a little bit longer a history of tar spot than maybe some people think. It really kind of goes back to 2015. So this is our 6th year with dealing with the disease. We really found it in a few places in 2015 at first. A few places were I would say fairly heavy. I don't think we really experienced much yield loss at all in those areas, but at least that year we were able to detect it in multiple counties throughout northern Illinois. I would say the majority of my counties, a little bit, which is Interstate 80 and north, a few counties south of there. And like I said, not all of those, most of those weren't to any sort of heavy pressure, so to speak, but it was in numerous counties that first year. Fast forward, really in 16, we didn't really have much. We had it in some of the same areas, but really wasn't a problem. 17 was kind of the same way, but really 18 obviously is the first year that we had major problems. And a majority of that was in my territory in southern Wisconsin, far northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Since then, it's been expanding outside of those areas. So it's worked its way all through Iowa, well up into Wisconsin, into Minnesota, into Michigan. Now it's been found in Canada, across the border, and it's also started to work its way south. So, it's kind of taken 6 years to do that.
Right.
And not every one of those years has been heavy.
Right. And I think our experience in central Illinois somewhat mirrors yours, just 3 years behind. I would say we saw it widely distributed probably for the first time in 19, got a little more widely distributed and easier to find in 20. Now here in 21, we've had our first, what I would call, bad tar spot year in areas in central Illinois. And I think our producers are, nervous that it appears as though we're on a trajectory where it just gets worse every year. You've seen up and down years in northern Illinois as far as tar spot pressure. So just talk about what is it other than the presence of the pathogen that helps to determine whether it's going to be bad or not.
Sure. So it's really, the comforting part is it's just like any other disease, right? So you can have a heavy year of northern corn leaf blight one year, and if you do not have the environment the next year, you're probably going to see it. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with tar spot. So we go back to 2018, where we had a major issue, and we had tons of inoculum in virtually every field. across all of northern Illinois. And that next year, we hardly saw a thing. So we had the disease, but it was never yield limiting in any one of those situations. So, your question really gets down to environment. All diseases are very important. It's very important to have the environment. Just because you have a pathogen doesn't mean that you're going to have disease. And really that environment is favored by, precipitation and humidity. So, high dew points, things like that. It seems like this year, once again, the areas that had more rainfall tended to have more disease, and the areas that didn't tended not to. I do think that there's a little bit more importance on, humidity, moisture levels in the air than maybe we give it credit.
Certainly have to have rain if you've got plenty.
That can help, propagate it in the absence of rainfall. But when you look at, again, that are heavy this year, it's the above average rainfall areas.
So what impact does temperature have? I've always thought it was kind of a cooler environments that favored it. I would argue we haven't had a hot summer, but it hasn't necessarily been cool either. What impact do you think temperature has on?
So it's still going to have some impact. I mean, it tends to favor cooler temperatures, but that doesn't mean that once you get outside of that range that the disease can't continue to go. And I've seen the same thing where you have a warmer stretch / hot. It's still going to progress. It may not be as fast as it would be if it were in the upper 70s and cloudy. But it gets to a point when you have so much disease that you have so much inoculum there, even if you're just a little bit outside of that optimum range, it can still continue to propagate, especially if you have moisture.
Right. So I guess talk about how it, where does the infection start? How does it move up through the canopy? And, it seems like it's almost always, I'll say always, worse in the lower canopy and seems to progress upward. Southern rust can show up anywhere in the canopy sometimes, but with tar spot always seems to start low and move up. Talk about how that infection occurs.
Yeah. So the one big difference between that and southern rust is that it overwinters here. It overwinters in residue. It overwinters in the fields once we have it. Whereas southern rust and most of the rust they blow in, so they do not overwinter here, and that's why you see it in the lower canopy, and then it works its way up. That's classic of diseases, foliar diseases that overwinter in the same field. We do get to a point where you get the community spread portion of that we're familiar with, of the disease, where if you have so much inoculum floating around, it will move. And we saw that several years ago, especially in fields that hadn't had it before. Even in seed corn fields, we had it move in, but it's starting in the field and then working its way up.
Do you think when you and I have talked about, sometimes it looks like corn on corn's worse, but you find occasionally really bad fields that are rotated as well. Do you feel in those rotated fields that have a surprising amount in it, do you think that's coming from 2-year-old residue in that field, or do you think that's more the community spread, came in from somewhere else?
I don't know.
Okay.
And I don't know that anybody really knows.
Yeah. And I guess one other thing relative to that, talk about the importance of light and humidity and just the environment in the lower canopy, and maybe regardless of where the inoculum came from, maybe the environment's just right in the lower canopy, and that's why it starts there.
Yep. So from an environmental standpoint, one thing that we know, at least from the research that was done years ago, a lot of that was done in Central America, et cetera, in Mexico, that it is favored by high humidity, cooler temperatures, and lower light quality. So a higher number of cloudy days, and high humidity, rainfall, obviously, clouds can come along with that rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
All those things will favor it. So when you think about all those things and you look at the lower canopy, all those things are there.
Always dark.
It's less light. It's higher humidity. It tends to be cooler in the lower canopy. All those things are favored. So I do think that, when you start talking about that community spread, that's the environment that's favorable, and that's going to favor that lower canopy as well.
Right.
And that's one reason why it's a little bit harder for that disease to keep moving up in the canopy, like some other diseases.
Right. Yeah, I wonder, too. I've talked a lot about, the light quality that we've had this year being diminished, partly due to cloudiness with all the rains that we've had, and when it's not raining, it's hazy from somebody's wildfire somewhere. So we've had a pretty, I would say, low light growing season. And I wonder how much of a factor that could be in the fact that we've seen it kind of explode in our market this year. And I also wonder how, you see how fast it progresses in the lower canopy. It's very scary to imagine the upper canopy, going through that same progression, but the upper canopy is a different environment. You got more light, it's drier, it's warmer, it's probably not as good of an environment for the disease. But doesn't mean that it can't progress and continue to get bad in the upper canopy.
Yeah, and we saw that several years ago. Like if you have in 18, I just remember August being cloudy and hazy from basically fog. A lot of the days in August, and so even though normally the upper canopy is there's more air moving, there's more light there. That year, the upper canopy was about the same as the lower canopy in August. So that's what drove some of that to keep going as well. So I did want to mention, so you talked about or asked me about rotation and the corn on corn. To some extent, we're not really sure. Rotating can't hurt for a number of reasons. Right. But for whatever reason, we still see some pretty heavy situations in rotated situations as well. So, I don't want guys to think that if they rotate, they're going to totally get away from the problem, because that's not the case. Right. And we had some cases. One in particular that I know of in 18, where we had a really heavy field that was beans the previous year and then wheat the previous year before that. So that takes it all the way back to 2015, which was the initial year of when we saw it. So either it would have had to over winter, basically 2 seasons or 3 seasons, whatever, or you're relying more on that community spread to be a problem.
And that's that's frustrating that what you do in your field might exacerbate the problem, but what you do in your field can't prevent the problem either. And we see other diseases like that. I mean, diplodia can certainly move into a field too. Although what you do in your field has a pretty big impact on that disease, but we do see other diseases that are mobile enough that you can't keep it out of your field necessarily by tillage or by rotation or by those means, even though in some situations those practices do tend to reduce inoculum pressure.
So, and we just don't know enough about how this stuff overwinters. We've learned some things, but we've also learned how much we don't know about it at the same time.
Well, we probably made assumptions to the best of our ability that 5 or 10 years down the road, with more research and better understanding, we may learn that that really wasn't correct in the first place. We just thought it was.
And that's how science works.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about hybrids. There's going to be lots of talk probably about this one's worse than that one. How much of a difference is there between genetics, and what are we doing, and what is the seed industry doing to try to quantify that better? And do you think there's a genetic solution, let's say, to the problem down the road?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, Bayer as a research organization is certainly looking into that. I mean, we've identified germplasm in Mexico that does very well against tar spot. In the meantime, we're looking at germplasm in our North American pool that is better than the average stuff. So those are things that we're working with now as a breeding organization, to try and bring those into commercial products. So that really is the shorter term solution, and then potentially the longer term solution is incorporating more of that external germplasm, if you will, that may be even stronger. So right now, all North American germplasm is susceptible. It's just some is a little bit more susceptible than others. All right. So basically, there's not really a hybrid on the market that's going to prevent you from having to spray a fungicide if you have heavy disease. So we've utilized a product in Northern Illinois that's pretty tolerant on it. Not going to prevent you from having a spray, but it's better than some of the others. So, I mean, short answer is, genetic tolerance is definitely going to be a factor in this going forward. But we're still going to rely on other things like fungicides to help manage it.
To that point, we're here at our focus site in Roanoke, Illinois today, and actually at this focus site yesterday and today, there are tours of some of the research trials that are going on here. And one of those particular trials was a timing and germplasm demonstration on tar spot. And this is sometimes when you're doing research, you hope a problem happens because it gives you a good opportunity to learn. I certainly don't like to see 6 or 8 million acres of corn in Illinois with tar spot in it, but it did give us a good opportunity to do some testing, and we did use that particular more tolerant hybrid and a hybrid that we felt was more susceptible. And honestly, when you look at them unsprayed in those plots, there's a difference between the two, but there's a lot of tar spot in both of them. So to your point, Jim, the fungicides did perform very well in this demonstration, actually better than I've seen them look in other places I have looked. So let's talk a little bit about fungicides, what we think is, best management practices if you're going to try to control or lessen, control gives the impression we can stop it. Manage, let's say, tar spot with a fungicide. What do you think are some of the best approaches?
I guess, first of all, I do want to reiterate that fungicides do work. And, there's a lot of, back to the first year that we really had to deal with it, up until now, we still got a lot of questions on, are they really doing anything? Because we have situations where we have extremely heavy pressure. And, when you have a disease that's that virulent, so that aggressive, and you have germplasm that's susceptible, that combination can really make things look like the fungicide's not doing anything. Right. And then, you bring in other things like, a fungicide. And, in the past, working with gray leaf spot or northern corn leaf blight, diseases where we have pretty good genetic tolerance to them, some of those coverage things don't become as critical, right? But when you get to a situation where you have a really virulent disease and pretty susceptible germplasm, coverage is everything. Right. So things like that make a big difference on, a grower's perception on whether something is working or not.
Relative to that, do you, and this is and I know you warned me ahead of time that I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask that we don't have the answer, and that's perfectly fine. We're just having a conversation. Yep. Do you have a gut feel for, do you think we can protect the upper canopy regardless of what's going on in the lower canopy? Or do you think we need to provide some protection of the lower canopy so that it's not such an inoculum source to overwhelm the upper canopy? Right. We usually talk about, with most diseases, if we keep the plant healthy above the ear, we're probably protecting yield. I have a little bit of a worry or a concern or a question, when your lower canopy is lit up with tar spot, is that going to overwhelm our ability to protect the upper canopy? So do we actually need to worry about controlling it in the lower canopy if we can?
Yeah, I mean, I share the same concerns, and just exactly how you stated it.
Mm-hmm. Because he pointed out, I don't know anything.
Crappy minds think alike. So obviously protection of the upper half of the canopy is most important for yield. But I'm 100% with you in that if you're not controlling the lower canopy, so I think that's one thing that we have to think about is, that's where that disease is coming in. And I think of tar spot a lot like southern rust up here in terms of its virulence
Mm-hmm.
and its ability to move fast. Mm-hmm. But the difference is tar spot can come within, and overwinters. Yes. And southern rust takes a while to get here. Yeah. So if you had the equivalent of southern rust that stays here mm-hmm. and starts infecting in lower canopy, mm-hmm. I think you have tar spot.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So, kind of going back to your question, if we're not getting fungicide to that lower canopy, basically we're letting free rein in on those lower leaves. Right. And that is providing inoculum to the nth degree that once that residual wears out on where you do get the application, 14 to 21 days, whatever, boom, it's going again. Right. So I do think, and we've seen that. My feeling still is that we need to make sure that application is earlier mm-hmm. Before we get really heavy disease. And we can probably spend 15 minutes on that.
Right. Right.
But keep in mind that fungicides work best before disease infection.
Yes.
And not as well after.
One producer I talked to, commented to me that he had used a fungicide product that we consider to be one of the better ones on tar spot. That application was made on July 24th. I don't really know what stage the crop was at on July 24th, but he commented to me when he was walking in the field on July 4th, so 3 weeks prior to the fungicide application, he was already seeing tar spot at that time. And he's pretty disappointed in what he believes was kind of poor performance of the fungicide on how much tar spot he's seeing. Now, to your point, we don't know what that field would look like if it didn't have fungicide on it, so I'm sure it helped. But given that disease a 3 or 4 week head start on the fungicide application, I think is also a big factor in him being disappointed in what he's seeing, because there was a whole lot of infection that had already occurred long before the fungicide went on.
Yeah, and there's a push to, or has always been a push to apply those fungicides a little bit later. To the point where you get to brown silk, mm-hmm. and maybe that was okay before, mm-hmm. but not so much now with this disease. And then when you look at 2021 and our delays in application, basically we had later applications multiplied by later applications.
Yes, yeah. When you start maybe too late and then get a delay, then you're really too late.
Right. So then you're looking at 3 weeks plus of disease development, mm-hmm. and just like you said, you can have a bunch of disease there and not see it, and then you make your application, and then all of a sudden you see a bunch.
Right.
That's not the fungicide's fault.
Right.
That was already there when you made the application.
Talk about, I think almost all fungicides have a rate range on the label. The recommended rate of most products is generally not the maximum label rate.
Correct. It's usually the minimum.
Talk about, and they're kind of all priced for that lower rate, basically to be the standard rate. To talk about the impact that the rate has on the level of efficacy of control.
Yeah, no, it does have an impact. Generally when I find myself in a situation where I have, heavier disease coming in, especially with something that's very, very aggressive, I'm going to up that fungicide rate, because that's going to give you, it's going to give you better control, and it's going to give you better. And this really isn't with tar spot. It's, you know, known for other diseases too. Anytime you find yourself in a heavy disease situation, and you know, you really have it coming on, and the environment is very favorable, you're better off upping that rate. And we've seen that in the data where, you know, we do a higher rate of even the straight strobilurin, and it gives you that much more control. So there certainly is something there to that. It's not necessarily something that I recommend just, you know, on a day-by-day basis. But if I know that the environment is very favorable and I've already got a lot of disease, I'm going to recommend a higher rate in that situation.
I mean, I see a need for, you know, a lot more, you know, in-field research on timing, rate, sequential applications, timing of those sequentials. You know, how does a maximum rate compare to 2 standard rates in a split shot, you know, kind of thing. You know, and the challenge for growers obviously is going to be, you know, how much are you willing to invest in protecting the crop when you frankly don't really know how bad the pathogen is going to be, because as you said, we need to get ahead of this stuff, and that's I think a frustrating thing for growers. It feels like somebody's just trying to scare you into spending money. But if you wait until you see how bad it's going to be, it's kind of too late to fix it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I hate having that conversation about, you know, making a second application. But in some of these scenarios, it is needed.
Yeah. And we've had some second applications in my geography this year. People, you know, it's a high value crop. Our crop looks good. It's, you know, guys are eager to get into what they think might be the best crop they've ever had at prices that are, you know, historically high considering the yield level that we're at least for central Illinois. I know there's parts of the country that are, you know, the reason we've got high prices, and they're not happy with central Illinois because we're going to contribute a lot of bushels to the U.S. corn crop. But, you know, there's been some people who looked at it like, hey, you know, 5 or 6 bushel, I'll break even on this application. I think I got 260 plus corn. I'm not willing to take a chance on it. But most of our sequential applications went out in early dent stage. So I do kind of think there's probably some fields that could have benefited from different timings and maybe multiple applications, but I do wonder if that second shot at early to mid R5 is going to do much.
Yeah, it really is hard to tell. I mean, you're very much on the bubble there on what you're going to see. It's certainly going to depend on, you know, what the environment was, you know, from there on out. You know, I tend to think that there will probably be more cases where it did pay off even that late, especially if you keep getting rainfall coming through. I know Marty Chilvers out of Michigan State, you know, he's referenced data where, you know, basically they showed I want to say it was a late R4 application, did pay off in a big way. They weren't able to repeat it the next year, but they may not have had the disease as much as they did that previous year. I will go back and say that the next year, so after we had our epidemic, we basically started initiating those fungicide trials, because those were the questions that I had, was that I think that there was a number of acres in 18 that could have benefited from a secondary application. We just didn't know it. But what did that look like from a timing standpoint? What did we need to do it at V7? You know, is it just a VT R3 type deal? And we implemented those, and we did several around the country, especially in Illinois. As you know, the best way to cure a problem is to put a trial out. And in 2018, we didn't have any disease. So some of it,
19,
excuse me. Yeah. 18 we had
18 had disease and no trials. Yeah. 19 had trials and no disease. That's pathology, people. That's the way that works.
Yeah. Yep. So some of that is we've been doing the trials. We just haven't been able to luck out and get really good disease. Now, I'm hoping But this year we've got them in some good spots. So hopefully we can pick those up, but kind of have to rely on a little bit of luck too.
Right. So talk about, we talked about southern rust, we talked about gray leaf spot, we talked about northern corn leaf blight, the other diseases that we're more used to. You see the lesion on the leaf. The rest of the leaf is fairly healthy. And as long as the leaf doesn't become covered with lesions, the rest of the leaf is still alive. Tar spot seems different to me. You start with the black tar lesions on a green leaf, and then it seems like once the load of lesions gets to a certain point, I don't know what that point is, but you get to a certain point, and then that leaf kind of starts to prematurely senesce, and you go from green leaf with tar spot to yellow leaf with tar spot to brown leaf with tar spot. I don't feel like I see that same progression with the other foliar diseases that we fight. What's different about tar spot? I know this is one of those questions we don't maybe know the answer to,
Don't know.
but our listeners would rather hear you speculate than me, Jim. So
rather hear me say.
So please climb out on a limb for me and explain that.
I don't know. In Central America and Mexico, they always looked at tar spot with a companion pathogen. And basically they never had any problems with the tar spot itself. But then they would get those fisheye symptoms, and they always claimed that it was because of a secondary pathogen called Monographella matus. And basically that secondary infection is really what caused that fisheye symptomology. We've seen the fisheye symptomology here, and none of our university colleagues have ever been able to isolate that secondary pathogen. We still have the fisheyes, we still have the necrosis, but we've never been able to isolate that. What's going on there? Thinks that sometimes there's a lot more lesions there. There's a lot more disease that's infecting once you get past that point. So some of this is just an overwhelming load of new infections that's just causing death.
It reminds me of, a little bit the way crown rot overwhelms a plant. That's the whole plant. Tar spot's more overwhelming an individual leaf, but it's like it gets to a point where it just kind of gives up.
Right.
And then that leaf senesces. Sometimes can look a lot like nitrogen deficiency. Sometimes can look a lot like drought stress. Sometimes looks like other things. And you kind of wonder in some cases, is it truly the tar spot that's doing that? Or, was that leaf about to do that anyway, and the tar spot just kind of pushed it over the edge? Or, what's the relationship
how
there?
much is a host reaction versus, is it the pathogen itself?
Right.
Is there some other, I believe they've tested for compounds and stuff.
Yeah, I
haven't found any.
I know you and I have had this conversation. My first thought was, it looks like that fungus is producing some sort of toxin, like sudden death does, and that's what's contributing to things. But I know you told me the researchers haven't really been able to isolate anything.
Yeah, and the weird thing is you'll have some tar spot stroma. It's a fancy word for lesions for this particular pathogen. You'll have some stroma that'll cause the nice fisheye.
Yes.
And then you'll have some there's absolutely none there.
Yeah.
So there's some speculation there. Is there different genotypes, of the species there that are causing different. But there's a lot of work to be done on that. I want to manage and kill it.
Right. Yeah. So I guess, so Amy, has anybody live chatted any questions in? Do you
have no questions?
Okay.
We do have a comment.
A comment.
Dustin Spears wants Jim to know that he's looking pretty pumped on this Friday morning.
Oh,
and
cool.
I would have to confirm that anytime
sleeves on that pole there, but
that's honestly
sun's out, guns out.
Jim, could you talk though? My question, I guess, really kind of revolves around how much tar spot can you have without impacting yield? You know, we see a lot of it, and I've seen a lot of it in my fields here. I'm kind of on the cusp of central and northern Illinois. I've seen a lot of tar spot, but it hasn't necessarily had an impact on yield. Is there a way you can kind of quantify that?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back, for me, it kind of comes back to, some of the other diseases. Once you really start to get quite a bit of, infections around that ear leaf, that's when I start to get concerned. I don't think there's a lot of data on like severity percent on the ear leaf to say that that's doing X amount of yield, but I'm trying to keep that ear leaf fairly clean to prevent that. But a lot of times you're seeing a decent amount. I mean, you're seeing some necrosis on those lower leaves with disease amount. So
right.
Start to get, pretty severe infections in the lower canopy. That's when I get nervous about starting to get some yield loss.
I think, for me, it's been kind of a question of, it got pretty bad up to the ear leaf pretty quickly. And we were maybe 3 weeks from black layer in a lot of situations when it was pretty bad up to the ear leaf. And the upper canopy, I personally don't think has enough tar spot in it to impact yield a lot. But how bad is it going to get in that 3 week period till we get to black layer? And that to me was the unknown. Was it worth making that later application to keep that upper canopy healthy? Was the upper canopy already infected and you couldn't keep it healthy? Or was it not infected and it wasn't going to even get infected, and which would kind of make that expense maybe unnecessary? And those were the questions I was getting that I couldn't answer, frankly. And it came down to, like it does with many things, it's a personal decision. It's your crop, it's your money. We'll give you the best advice we can, but you're going to have to make your own call. And I always encourage people to leave me some check strips, split some fields. I have a hard time getting people to do that once they make the decision. This is what I'm going to do. They tend to want to do that on every acre.
Yeah.
But I do hope that we do get some learning opportunities from some of these late applications.
Yeah, I would say that, late planted trial, it was kind of perfect because, I mean, it suffered major yield loss because it was so late in maturity compared to everything else. And everything else around it was infecting it, and the weather was perfect. But I came in super late. So there was a lot of disease there already. And I did a 2 X-ray, mind you, but came in super late, and you can see a huge difference. Nice pictures and everything. We'll have to pull those out of the vault. But if or quite a bit line, so to speak, I would still do it because it made a huge difference on greenness and longevity of the plant.
Right.
So,
yeah, and that's kind of what's caught me off guard a little bit, I guess, with tar spot is I just didn't, I knew it could spread fast. I knew it was aggressive. I knew it was virulent. I knew the host was very susceptible, but I guess I didn't realize that at a certain point, the leaf just dies. The leaf just dies, and losing that greenness, is probably to me the most dramatic impact of it. I was used to seeing, green leaves with what's the fancy word for leaf? Stroma. Green leaves with stroma on them, but I hadn't seen it progress to the point where it was killing those leaves.
You actually got necrosis.
Yeah. And that, that's probably what has spooked our growers the most is, in a 2 or 3 week period, your lower canopy went from green to dead. And it didn't really happen in 2 to 3 weeks. It was, 2 months worth of infection. Yes.
Right.
But it gives the appearance that it happened in a 2 or 3 week period.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's burned in our brains a little bit from a few years ago. So we have that advantage, or had that advantage. And again, that's where we saw even sprayed fields in 18. First week of August, it really didn't seem all that bad. And then by 3 weeks later, you're like, oh, crap. So, when the calendar turned August and we started to see, most of my territory didn't have major problems. There's a few more that you see now, but especially in like areas in Grundy County, you started to see a lot more infection coming in that first week of August. Then, that's kind of a concern. That was kind of a concern for me, and we started doing some secondary applications.
And I think too, we're talking about calendar dates. What probably matters more than the calendar date is what's the growth stage of the crop.
Absolutely.
And our central Illinois crop in a normal year will be further along on August 1st than your crop will be. So, do we, if it starts on the same calendar date, north and south, it's going to do more damage north probably because the crop would have been less mature. If it starts at R1 in the north and R1 in the south, in theory, it can do the same amount of damage just on a different calendar date. So, we'll learn more about what type of yield impacts we're seeing. There's obviously a lot of people very enthusiastic about the potential of the crop. We've got in some areas you've been very dry in parts of your area. I've had areas that would have gladly given you 8 inches of water in the growing season that they got that they didn't need.
Yep.
So between you and I, we've got drought-stricken areas, we've got flooded out areas, we've got there's other things going on in the crop, but certainly there's enough southern rust out there in places, enough tar spot. I'm kind of on the transition, so the southern end of my territory has got more southern rust than tar spot. Right in the middle, we got quite a lot of both, actually. Those guys are fortunate. They had a pretty good environment for both. And then as you slide north, there's more tar, less southern rust. Last year you had more southern rust than I did early with some of the storm fronts that kind of looped around and caught northern Illinois. So it is, these pathogens, are they here? Are they coming in? When do they come in? How do they come in? It just, every year is different. And that makes it hard to manage. We tend to want to find a management practice that we like and just stick with it. And as the pathogens change and the environment changes, we may have to tweak that management system.
Mother Nature is not obliged to follow our management practices.
Right. So, any other questions come in, Amy, or anything on the chat? So we do have, we might go a little bit long since we started late. So if you've got questions, please chat them in. I appreciate those of you who stuck around long enough to see that this episode actually did happen. The recording will be here on YouTube. So those who gave up waiting on us, maybe they'll get to see it in a recorded fashion later. But do recognize we're probably going to wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. So if you do have a question, please chat it in. Amy, producer Amy, is monitoring the chat, so we'll certainly get your questions answered. So I guess other things that I think will probably come up, Jim, row spacing, tillage, population. Think about some of those. It's frustrating. Crown rot works a little bit this way. Everything we do to drive yield creates a better environment for the pathogen. Talk about some of those things in relation to tar spot.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we always say to residue to help prevent disease, overwintering, etc. Not sure that really makes a difference.
I don't think sizing does anything.
No, and I don't think so.
I think
either.
We're talking burial if you want to maybe do something.
Yeah, and even then, we don't have enough data to say that does hardly anything to go out and say that, yeah, you need to mow or plow your stuff to get ready for tar spot. That we're not even close to that. So tillage may help. But I wouldn't even guarantee that it would. I haven't seen anything to say that, again, that tillage alone would reduction in disease. Rotation, we kind of already talked about that. Fertility wise, there was some, data or at least suggestion from colleagues in Mexico that said, higher nitrogen, higher fertility tended to lead to more disease. And it probably comes back to, high fertility environment leads to nice, tall, beautiful corn.
Right, right.
And nice, tall, beautiful corn leads to a really nice lower canopy environment. Right. And that goes for other diseases too. So, my guess is that's probably what's going on and what you're doing to create an awesome crop.
Yeah. This relates very, very well to an observation I made in a field. One of the worst fields I've been in this year was in McDonough County, near Macomb. And there was an area of the field that was next to the driveway, next to the grain bin site, kind of a high traffic area, compacted area, a little bit of a low spot. That crop almost died there from ponding. It was growing in a tough situation. That corn was tasseled out about 5 feet tall. It was yellow all summer long, just looked like heck. And the rest of the field was, 260 plus corn, just beautiful. And today, when you go to that field, the greenest corn in the field is the stunted wet hole, because the rest of the field's lit up with tar spot, and you see almost no spot in that stunted crappy corn area. I just envisioned that, sunlight was getting to the bottom of those plants virtually all summer long. It was never lush or dark or anything in the lower canopy, and those plants just almost avoided infection, it appears. And the good parts of the field, got a lot of tar spot in it. So it just kind of goes to that, everything you do to, make your corn all it could be, is, at least in that lower canopy, making a better environment for tar spot.
Which obviously doesn't mean that we don't want you to put nitrogen and fertility on. It's just one of those things.
Raising crappy corn would be the solution for brown rot too, but that's not a very good solution.
So I did want to touch on planting date, because there's a little bit of that ties in. So if I want to go out and try and find tar spot in any given year early, I will go to the earlier planted fields. The later planted fields, it takes longer for disease to show up there. Again, I think it's about the canopy.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to find it until you get, corn above your head.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that kind of goes back to environment, but I'm going to go to the early planted corn. As far as this year, kind of what I mentioned before is the later planted corn is probably most susceptible to the higher yield loss, because it has farther to go, and there's more inoculum out there during that grain fill period than the early planted stuff has.
Could completely miss infection if the environment wasn't right, perhaps. But if you get that infection and it's bad, going to have more yield loss in that late stuff. And I've got some kind of interesting, due to unfortunate circumstances, planting date comparisons. So, at Monmouth, we've actually got a demo trial that got planted very late. There's 20 or 30 different hybrids in there that was planted first week of June. And then I've got an area in my territory, close to home, actually, southern Knox County, northern Fulton County, had a horrific hail event on Father's Day weekend, and along with about 3 or 4 inches of rain, so nobody could replant anything until about July 5th. And so there's actually some corn that it was such bad hail, they tore up the stand of corn and replanted corn July 5th. So there's a few hundred acres of early July planted corn right in the midst of some hot tar spot. And knock on wood for those guys, I don't think they were in any mood to invest in fungicide on their July planted corn. So that stuff is probably totally unprotected from tar spot. So will be interesting to see what happens to that. I mean, it may get froze off anyway. It may not make much difference. But it's pollinating now. Looks damn good for July 5th planted corn. And, pretty healthy right now, but it's not very mature and it's got a long way to go. So. So we'll see.
I would say it's going to get a lot by the time that either the frost gets it or whatever.
Yeah. So we've touched a lot on fungicides. We've talked a lot about the disease. I guess from a breeding perspective, you mentioned in other parts of the world where it's been around a lot longer than it's been here, we've been able to breed for resistance. So we don't have to make a trait. We don't have to find a biotech solution. We know there is genetics in corn that will confer some level of resistance to tar spot. It's just a matter of getting those genetics migrated into our hybrids here in North America. So that, that takes time, but it doesn't take forever. So there should be some genetic improvements that breeders can make in germplasm. And I think you touched on this earlier with other diseases like gray leaf spot. I mean, we used to have highly susceptible gray leaf spot hybrids. We bred those out. I would say the most susceptible gray hybrid you could buy today is probably more resistant to gray than the most resistant tar spot hybrid you could buy today is to tar spot. So I think we use our fungicides on things like gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, even southern rust to a certain extent. You can buy a pretty good southern rust resistant hybrid if you select for it. And so we've got a pretty high level of resistance in the plant. And so the fungicide is helping that. When you look at tar spot, the fungicide's doing 99% of the work. And so that's what's different about it. If we were still planting hybrids that were, gray leaf spot could probably be as devastating as tar spot if we didn't have a pretty high level of resistance to gray leaf spot in the germplasm. So, I think that's the long-term, hopefully, solution to the problem, at least in the to the best of our ability. Solution to the problem is to get hybrids that are more resistant.
Agreed.
So, okay. Well, Amy, anything else come in on the chat? Any questions you have that we didn't answer? So,
of course I have questions.
Okay. Well, you ask us one if you. Okay. It doesn't even have to be about tar spot. We're here. It's free, so we'll just keep rolling.
No, there's no more questions that come in on the chat, but maybe kind of to potentially put a bow on, this conversation around tar spot.
Salesmen are always good for putting bows on things.
I know.
We just kind of cut it off there.
There you have it.
That's all, folks.
We're done. But maybe really in all sincerity, Jim, you've got a lot of experience with tar spot, probably over 5 years of experience with tar spot. If you had to kind of maybe take what your key learnings are from this and turn it into just general advice for Central Illinois growers, if you kind of sum it up in a few sentences, what would be your best advice you have for Central Illinois growers in handling tar spot?
It's a really good question. So I would say, first of all, in the immediate, for the immediate term, when we look at 2021, is make sure you're keeping an eye on stuff, because if you may have had some fields that maybe needed a second application and maybe didn't happen, some of that, even if you don't exhibit yield loss, it may have some standability, some detriment to standability. So I want guys to make sure that they're checking for standability issues, like we always recommend every year.
And we're already seeing those, Jim. I mean, I think the cannibalization that has occurred due to, maybe nutrient stress, heat stress, foliar disease issues, height. I mean, anytime you've got 200 and whatever-ish bushel corn trying to fill that ear,
that's a stress in and of itself
on the stalk. Yeah. So we've had some wind events lately, and I've got green corn that has lodged, and the stalk wasn't rotten, but it's weak. We're not snapping anything off. It's just kinking it over.
Right.
And I am concerned about stalk quality and stalk cannibalization, and tar spot's just one more thing that's going to contribute to that.
Yeah. So that's the more immediate thing for those Central Illinois growers. What I would say is, moving forward is first of all, it can be totally different next year. And so I don't want producers to do any sort of knee-jerk reactions based on what they saw this year, because like we saw, you can have extremely heavy pressure and not have a thing next year based on differing environments and differing years. With that being said, though, we do have to make sure that we're keeping a close eye on things moving forward, and that, fungicides are going to play a key role. and that also to reiterate and reinstate that fungicides do work. Basically for all the reasons we talked about, sometimes we may need a secondary application, but that's not through fault of the fungicide. That's because of the aggressive nature.
So one follow-up question, and we're not going to turn Ask the Agronomist into a commercial for fungicides, but the fungicides do work, they help, but they're probably not equal when it comes to tar spot.
Yeah,
fair statement.
No, that's a fair statement. So, like you said, I'm not going to turn into a commercial, but there are some that are a little bit better than others. So I tend to think ours is pretty good.
Right. So where do people go for those sources of information if you maybe don't trust your salesman?
Yeah, we all look at him.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
So, reach out to your universities. Several universities, Purdue, Michigan State, Illinois, Wisconsin have done fungicide trials. And they're going to have some more this year. They're going to have some pretty good data. Lean on those and look at all of them. Look at all of them together and look to see which one is you think is going to work out best. We've looked at Delaro over the years. We actually looked at those active ingredients in Mexico on Mexico tar spot before we were even Bayer, and the active ingredients in Delaro performed very well down there.
Yeah.
And
we've seen that here as well.
And we've seen that here in university data.
Yeah.
So that I'm very encouraged by that performance. But yeah, I would just say it can be very emotional. I know, we've been through that, but I also know that every year is different, but also that we have tools to manage it, and it may take a little bit different thinking than we're used to as far as using fungicides. But what we saw in 18 is that they worked, and you could tell where it wasn't. You may have situations where it looked like it didn't do anything, but I can assure you it did. And manage it. We just have to be a little bit more aggressive with it.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks a lot for joining us. Appreciate you making the effort. Apologize for the technical difficulties that we had to kick things off. So we'll be back in a couple more weeks, probably back in our normal Thursday morning time slot. Hopefully there's not some new issue going on specifically that we need to bring in an expert for, but if there is, and thanks a lot. So join us, join our YouTube channel, log into YouTube. We can get reminders for the Ask the Agronomist broadcast if you do that. If you have thoughts of things you'd like to see in future episodes, if you have questions, get those to your FSR, email those in. Continue to really want to get a bigger live audience and more interaction. That's what I think makes Ask the Agronomist fun, is people chatting in live questions and people engaging in this. So appreciate you joining here this morning, and everybody be safe. You got to do is just hit end and end again.